A long time ago, after the great flood, the peoples of the earth came together. They could all understand each other because they all spoke the same language, and together they decided to build a tower that would reach to heaven so they could make a name for themselves. But when the Holy One saw the tower, the Holy One decided that this could come to no good. And so the Holy One confused the people's speech so they could no longer understand each other, and scattered them over the face of the earth. This is a familiar story. We probably learned it in Hebrew school. We may have imagined or drawn that tower, the Tower of Babel, which gets its name from the confusion that suddenly broke out one day in the middle of the construction project. There's an ancient interpretation of the story, a midrash, which imagines that moment. God and the 70 angels who surround the throne of glory went down, and God confused their language into 70 nations and 70 languages, each one according to its nation and its writing and its language. And God appointed an angel to each nation. And the Midrash imagines the moment that followed, when people tried to speak to each other in their original tongue, but found they could no longer understand. What did they do? Asks the Midrash. Each man took his sword, and they fought and killed each other, and half the world fell there by the sword. We might say this is just a story, but stories don't have to be real to be true. This particular story is teaching us a profound truth about the way that human beings are wired, a kind of human default. That when we encounter difference, we immediately turn to violence. That default jumped into the headlines once more this year on May 25th. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, a black man, George Floyd, was arrested for allegedly using a counterfeit bill. Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, knelt on Floyd's neck for around 9 minutes. For the first 7 of those minutes, Floyd begged for his life and repeated, "I can't breathe." For the last 2 of those minutes, he was motionless. Chauvin's colleagues did not intervene. George Floyd was found unresponsive and pulseless inside the ambulance that was called and pronounced dead in the emergency room in the hospital. Protests erupted almost immediately. By June the 6th, polls suggested that they represented the largest turnout of individuals in this country, at around 4,700 demonstrations. There was a sense that a spark had been put to tinder. Other names, other deaths re-entered the headlines to be remembered and re-examined and re-evaluated. And for many of us, part of the way that we had previously understood the world, the way that we had previously understood difference between human beings, no longer made sense. Many of us, myself included, were brought up to believe that we were colorblind. Many of us, myself included, were brought up to believe that because we had historically or actually encountered anti-Semitism, that made us experts in understanding racism. Many of us realized that we had been only paying lip service to the reality of difference. As the author Robin DiAngelo sets out in her now widely read book, White Fragility, we discovered that we don't see ourselves in racial terms. Our opinions are uninformed. We don't understand socialization. We have a simplistic understanding of racism. It almost reads like a new Ashamnu. And predictably, at least predictably, if we have internalized the story of the Tower of Babel, the moving of difference to the foreground turned the atmosphere violent. From verbal violence as we engaged each other on social media to actual violence in the streets. While we can be proud that the demonstrations here in New Orleans were conducted passionately but civilly, the same cannot be said of elsewhere. And around the country and around the world, the Jewish community reacted, and feelings ran high. Friends on Facebook unfriended each other over what one of them had posted. Voices were raised across actual and virtual dining tables and garden fences, and phones were hung up. But on the whole, across the community, we saw a heartfelt attempt to question our own assumptions and express some kind of solidarity. Many of us marched. Reading groups sprang up. For a while, you couldn't find a copy of White Fragility or The New Jim Crow. An intense debate still ongoing concerned whether Jews could or should support Black Lives Matter, with rabbis weighing in on both sides from all across the Jewish spectrum. I recommend Orthodox rabbis Ari Hart and Avi Weiss to read on this. And as many of us realized how ignorant we were, a new kind of listening took place. My grandfather's words, "You've got two ears and one mouth for a reason," took on new meaning as we heard a great deal about the most repeated commandment in the Torah being the one to love the stranger. We read and watched first-person piece after first-person piece to try to understand others' experience and to activate our empathy. But it would be wrong for us to think that fixed it. Psychologist Paul Bloom argues that empathy is a kind of spotlight. It zooms in on the specific. We can try to put ourselves in the shoes of one other person, but what about 100 or 1,000,000 or 7 billion? We can't do it. Empathy, as he puts it, is in fact a hopelessly limited skill. Trying to put ourselves in someone else's shoes can sometimes compound the problem. Because Bloom goes on to argue that empathy can make us less forgiving. By shining a bright spotlight on a chosen few, we become blind to the perspective of others. Empathy and xenophobia are the flip side of each other. So as we contemplate these last 6 months, what are we supposed to do? Perhaps we have to start by admitting that just like the folk at the Tower of Babel, we don't understand each other's reality. We can't understand it. But, and this is where perhaps we can change the script, we can try to imagine it. And in making this shift away from the purely personal, from the purely emotional, we can open up some new possibilities. We can move from the singular to the plural. We cannot prevent a death that has already taken place, however much we mourn it, but we can and we need to notice and then address the disparities and the structures, both obvious and hidden, that made such a scenario possible in the first place. And then we need to get to work to change them. And we can shift from our feelings to our morality. Our drive to empathize, to react subjectively, can get in the way of achieving actual justice. As has been said by many Jewish teachers, notably Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the nature of tzedek, the word we use for justice, has everything to do with a moral imperative and very little to do with love. It's not enough to have strong feelings. It's not enough to have loving feelings. It's not enough to have empathy. It's not enough even to question our assumptions. We have to commit to achieving justice, which is more demanding and messier, and which is going to take longer. But we can leave the terminology of being colorblind behind us. Instead, we have to consciously acknowledge the existence of difference and then decide what we are going to do about it. And often these days, this is described as moving from being colorblind to being anti-racist. Perhaps this year that will be our cheshbon nefesh, our self-accounting. Perhaps over the next 10 days, each of us will Google the phrase from colorblind to anti-racist and study what comes up. Because we cannot be difference neutral. Difference is wired into the human race as it was from the very beginning. It's wired into the human race as a challenge for us to identify and engage with and face down, and ultimately move from a state of brokenness and waste and death to a state of tikkun and correction and rebuilding. And this is our work, and we must do it, not out of self-interest. We know that in a fundamentalist worldview, us Jews are going to go down with the ship because we're dispensable. But we must do it out of a commitment to stretching our imaginations beyond our personal ability to understand. Only then will we be able to avoid the fate of those who tried to build a tower to reach to heaven and instead ended up destroying each other. I want to acknowledge where I got this idea of differentiating between understanding and imagining. It comes from a member of our community, Dr. Mia Kearney-Banyeris. Mia, thank you. I trust, I hope that this year many of us are going to act on your wisdom. And I want to give the final voice to a voice of justice. The US courts have repeatedly considered cases about affirmative action, the policy of taking steps to favor groups that have previously been discriminated against. In 2014, a case in Michigan concerned a ballot initiative. The Supreme Court ruled 6-2 that a race-neutral policy was best. But Justice Sonia Sotomayor issued an unusually strong 58-page dissent. And here is an edited example of what she said. Race matters. Race matters in part because of the long history of racial minorities being denied access to the political process. Race also matters because of persistent racial inequality in society, inequality that cannot be ignored, and that has produced stark socioeconomic disparities. And race matters for reasons that cannot be wished away. Race matters to a young man's view of society when he spends his teenage years watching others tense up as he passes, no matter the neighborhood where he grew up. Race matters to a young woman's sense of self when she states her hometown and then is pressed, no, where are you really from, regardless of how many generations her family has been in the country. Race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce that most crippling of thoughts, I do not belong here. In my colleague's view, examining the racial impact of legislation only perpetuates racial discrimination. This refusal to accept the stark reality that race matters is regrettable. Perhaps this year will be the year when each of us engages with the many ways that race matters. And when we post this sermon on the Shul website, if you look for the written form, It has a couple of suggestions and lists of resources to use as a starting point. Shana Tova, and let's get to work.